Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about control of alpha oscillation with neurofeedback. So the big idea here is trying to think about how we might be able to gain control over certain aspects of brain function that we're normally unaware of and thus unable to control. So let's unpack the two terms in the title here. Okay, so first, what is an alpha oscillation? So here in this figure, we're taking a look at the electrical potential recorded from the scalp of a human when they're either excited or relaxed. And here, excited just means alert, paying attention to what's going on, whereas relaxed is kind of, well, relaxed, just kind of sitting there, not really doing too much. And what you can see is that when a participant is excited, you have this kind of fast and kind of arrhythmic activity going on where sometimes there are really quick little waves, and sometimes there are slower, larger spikes. But then when the participant becomes relaxed, we can see these really large amplitude, really regular rhythmic oscillations going on. And these oscillations, if we look across this 1 second period, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about 10 and a half oscillations going on in 1 second. And that's kind of the classic frequency that the alpha oscillation occurs at, anywhere between about 8 and 12 cycles per second. And the other thing you can see about the alpha oscillation is that it's really big. So the amplitude of the alpha oscillation here is on the order of 50 microvolts, whereas the ongoing activity in the alert brain is quite a bit less. So then what is neurofeedback? So neurofeedback is a situation where a participant is set up with EEG, so electroencephalogram, so you can record activity like what we were just looking at. And then the experimenter alerts the participant whenever their brain produces a certain state, so say the alpha rhythm, for example. And then the participant may be asked to identify or control their brain state. So we're going to look at some experiments where the participant is given a tone, and then every time that tone happens, the participant is asked to just identify, was your brain in alpha when the tone went off, yes or no? And then we're also going to look at some experiments where the participant is told, hey, I'm going to sound a tone anytime your brain is showing alpha oscillations. Can you try and make that tone stay on for as long as possible, trying to make the participant increase the amount of time that they spend in alpha, or on the flip side, you could give instructions to try and decrease the amount of time spent in alpha. Okay, so can participants identify the alpha rhythm? So the data that we're going to look at now is from Kamiya 1969, and this was really the first study that tried to look at identification and control of the alpha rhythm and kind of set off a lot of the excitement around neurofeedback and the alpha rhythm. So participants were first asked to identify whether their brain was in state A or state B. They were asked at random intervals, so just they'd be sitting there with the EEG cap on, and randomly a tone would play, and when they were told that means give us the response, either state A or state B. And then they were told they were correct whenever they differentiated alpha A from non-alpha B. Now, of course, the participants didn't have any explanation of what an alpha state was or what the brain state was that they were trying to identify. They were just told, hey, every time the tone plays, tell us A or B, and we're going to tell you if you're right or wrong. And the idea is that over time, they're going to kind of figure out, oh, there's this one state that is always state A and this other state that is always state B. So let's see how that played out. So Kamiya only reports the results of this experiment in text. Unfortunately, there's not a figure, but let's just read this off. So usually in the first hour or so, there was essentially chance performance. In the second hour, the subject very often began to get about 60% correct. In the third hour, subjects typically got about 75 or 80% correct. Some subjects became 100% correct in naming their brainwave state. Thus, subjects had learned to make correct discriminative responses to something that was going on inside their brains. All right, so that's pretty cool. Seems like people are able to get some kind of conscious awareness of when their brain is in an alpha state versus not in an alpha state. So can participants control alpha? So they kind of flowed onto this pretty naturally, and just continuing to read from Kamiya's original report. So now let me report an important finding that we came upon quite by accident. We said to the subject, look, obviously you've learned how to make this discrimination quite well. Let's see if you can produce those states that you have been calling A and B upon our command. The subject was told that if they heard the bell ring twice, he was to enter into the state he'd been calling A, and as soon as he heard the bell ring once, he was to change into the other state that he'd been calling B. We found that having successfully gone through the discrimination training, most subjects seemed to have at the same time acquired the skills necessary for the control of the brainwave states they had been discriminating. So the idea here then is that by gaining conscious awareness of the alpha state versus the non-alpha state, the participant has somehow gained control over the alpha state versus the non-alpha state, awareness leading to control. So then they took a look a little bit more quantitatively at control of the alpha oscillation now without pre-training. So in this situation, again, the participant is hearing a tone play anytime that they're not in alpha, and they're trying to keep that tone on for as long as possible. So we're looking here on the y-axis as EEG percent non-alpha per 30-second trial average of 5 successive trials. So here, a higher percentage non-alpha would be indicating that the participant is successfully avoiding the alpha state and thus is doing well. And across the x-axis, we're looking at time in the experiment, and each of the lines represents an individual participant. And aside from this participant AF, you can see that all of the other participants tend to go in an increasing trajectory. So they tend to get better and better at suppressing the alpha state. And then in a second phase of the experiment, the participants were suggested the strategy of using imagery as a way of suppressing the alpha state. So one thing that Kamiya had run across in interviewing his participants was that those who were successful at suppressing the alpha state tended to do so by conjuring a mental image. So mental imagery seemed to be something that blocked the alpha state. So he actually explicitly suggested this strategy to the participants, and you can see that when they were given this suggestion of a strategy, they all of a sudden all did really well, even that participant AF who was kind of struggling. So this is just looking at similar situation. Now we're looking at percent time in alpha. So before we were looking at time in non-alpha, now we're looking at time in alpha. And here participants were in alternating blocks. So for 3 minutes they were asked to increase their alpha, 3 minutes they were told to just sit and chill, 3 minutes they were told to decrease their alpha, 3 minutes they were told to increase their alpha, and they just kind of alternated like that. So what we're looking at here in the dotted lines are in the high alpha blocks and the low alpha blocks, and then the solid line is the basal level during those just sit and chill periods. And what you can see, not only does do the participants increase the amount of time they're spending in the high alpha and decrease the amount of time they're spending in alpha in the low alpha conditions, so they're successfully modulating the amount of time that they're spending in alpha. We can also see that the basal level of alpha oscillation is actually increasing. So what this suggests is that the participants are they have some kind of preference for the alpha state. Once they learn how to control the oscillation in the alpha versus the non-alpha state, when they're in that basal period of, hey, just sit and chill, they seem to be making some kind of a decision to stay in the alpha state. Okay. So how is control happening? So Kamiya claims that awareness of the states leads to control, but is that so? So also he claims that participants seem to recognize and prefer the alpha state, and that's what we saw in that last graph where it shows that the basal level of alpha is increasing across the course of the experiment, suggesting that when participants have a choice and are just told to, hey, just sit and chill, they're going to choose to stay in that alpha state once they learn how to control it. Now, this is kind of interesting because states of heightened alpha have also been observed in meditators. So Kamiya kind of makes the suggestion in his paper that neurofeedback could be some kind of a fast track to high meditative states. And that would be really cool if it's true, but is it? So then these other investigators, almost 10 years later, Black, Cott, and Pavlovsky, they came along and they decided they were going to try and replicate the findings that Kamiya had found. And So here we see their initial discrimination training. So just like Kamiya did, they started out by just training participants to discriminate between the alpha state and the non-alpha state. Just by playing a tone, every time the tone plays, the participant has to identify, hey, that's state A, or hey, that's state B. And this is a kind of confusing figure, but on the y-axis, we've got proportion from 0 to 1.0. And if we follow the solid line, what we're looking at here is proportion correct. So how often is the participant correct? And what we can see is that that is increasing across the course of trial blocks. So just like Kamiya found, they're finding that participants are capable of increasing the proportion of the time that they correctly identify the alpha state versus the non-alpha state. But then these two dotted lines, they break it down into proportion alpha correct and proportion non-alpha correct. And what we can see now is that there's a lot of variability going on here. So like in these last couple of blocks, this participant, if it's an alpha trial, then they tend to be really, really accurate. But if it's a non-alpha trials, those tend not to happen very often. So very, very few in this block, essentially no non-alpha correct trials, and almost all of the correct trials that the participant is getting come from the alpha state. And then we can see that there are reversals of this situation as well, like in block 6, the participant is getting lots and lots of non-alpha correct trials and very few alpha correct trials. So what's going on here? So they graphed these data a different way, and here what they showed was what's the probability that the participant is in an alpha state, that's what we see in the solid line, versus what's the probability that the participant gives an alpha response, and that's what we see in the dotted line. And so what you can see in the solid line is that the participant's brain state is actually varying quite a bit across the course of the experiment. So they go from situations where they have almost all alpha in a few of these blocks to other situations where they have almost no alpha. And what we can see is that the participant has an ability to match the probability of alpha to the probability of an alpha response. So this raises the possibility that the participant doesn't actually have any sensation of whether or not they're in an alpha state. Instead, they might simply be matching the overall probability of an alpha state to the probability of responding alpha, if that makes sense. So if you imagine that the brain is kind of drifting slowly between an alpha state and a non-alpha state, you could infer what state your brain is in simply by guessing on this two-choice discrimination and then matching your discrimination responses to the brain state by virtue of trial and error without any actual knowledge of what that brain state is. So they went ahead and checked for this possibility a little bit more rigorously. So in our next experiment, we attempted to keep the probabilities of alpha and non-alpha trial presentations near 0.5. So what this is going to do is it's going to make it so that probability matching is no longer going to be a useful strategy, because half of the trials are going to be alpha and half of them are going to be non-alpha. Trying to just use a guess and check method won't help. So in this experiment, none of the 8 subjects showed any learning after 400 discrimination trials. Thus, when the possibility of probability matching was controlled, subjects did not seem capable of discriminating alpha from non-alpha activity. Well, that's kind of too bad in terms of it would have been really cool if there was this ability to gain insight into the alpha versus the non-alpha state consciously. But this is a really nice experiment demonstrating a confound that maybe Kamiya hadn't thought of. So they went ahead though and they wanted to replicate whether or not you could get control of the alpha state even without discrimination. So here they're going to be doing something really similar to what Kamiya did. They're just going to be playing a tone anytime the participant has their brain in an alpha state, and then giving instruction that you either want to keep that tone on, so trying to increase alpha, or you want to keep that tone turned off, so trying to decrease alpha. But just like with Kamiya, they're not really explicitly telling the participants, hey, this is something to do with an alpha rhythm or anything like that. They're just saying, hey, you want to try and control this tone. And what we can see is that when the participant is given the non-alpha feedback, so that's where they're trying to decrease alpha, the amount of time spent in alpha, shown on the y-axis, decreases. Now, unlike what was seen in the Kamiya experiment, there is no increase in the amount of alpha when the participant is told to try and increase alpha. And that's a little bit weird. I'll come back to that. And then on the flip side, when we look at mean percent time non-alpha, we can see that the non-alpha feedback here causes quite a bit of an increase, but the alpha feedback doesn't really have a big effect. So the upshot from these two graphs is that participants are capable of increasing the amount of time that they spend in the non-alpha state and suppressing the amount of time that they spend in the alpha state, but they're not capable of doing the inverse, at least not in this experiment. They're not capable of increasing the alpha state while decreasing the amount of time spent in the non-alpha state. So that's really exactly the opposite of what Kamiya found, which is a little bit weird. So they had this comment on the impossibility of discrimination. So they said, although some subjects reported that they were sometimes able to originate an alpha or a non-alpha trial by using various strategies in an attempt to manipulate their EEGs, and could, therefore, respond correctly on those trials, all subjects felt that the discrimination task seemed impossible if such manipulations were not allowed. Pretty damning. Just there's no conscious awareness of the alpha state, according to these authors. But one thing that is interesting to point out is that it does seem like the participants are able to originate an alpha or a non-alpha trial by using various strategies. And this might be somewhat similar to Kamiya telling participants to use mental imagery as a way to block the alpha state. So now it becomes this question of what is the sensation that we're looking for? So Kamiya and Black, so both Kamiya and Black et al. Both talk about mental imagery as blocking alpha. And Kamiya mentions that the alpha state, on the flip side, is a state in which it is good not to be thinking too much about the outside world, one in which you just sort of listen for the tone and let it carry you along. So I think one thing that's important to think about kind of moving forward from these experiments is that for Kamiya, the blocking of or the use of mental imagery to block alpha and this idea of kind of relaxing and going with the flow, these are sufficiently strong sensations for him to say, hey, we're actually detecting the alpha state in the person's experience. Whereas Black et al. Seem implicitly to be looking for some kind of a direct sensation of alpha. They somehow want you to be able to say, oh yeah, I feel that 10 cycle per second oscillation really revving up. But that may not be the way in which the alpha oscillation actually manifests in experience. So although participants can't identify what an alpha state feels like, they can utilize feelings and thought patterns associated with alpha and non-alpha states to gain some control. Why can't they identify these feelings and thought patterns when not controlling them? So one possibility here would be that perhaps the alpha state is different when randomly occurring versus when controlled. And this is a little bit of a strange possibility, because you would think, regardless of how Kamiya and Black et al. Want to interpret the sensations that their participants are feeling associated with alpha states, you would think that a participant who's able to control an alpha state and who's able to recognize certain patterns of thought that are associated with the alpha and the non-alpha state should be able to identify those patterns of thought when not utilizing control and thus be good at discrimination. But Black et al. Really show pretty convincingly that the participants are really total shit at being able to do any discrimination between the alpha and the non-alpha states. So why don't you get any transfer? Well, one possibility would be that the randomly occurring alpha states are actually quite different from the alpha states that are seen when the participant is trying to exert some kind of control. So then the last piece that was a little bit strange in comparing these two studies was the increasing versus decreasing. So Kamiya found that participants could both increase and decrease alpha, but Black et al. Found that they could only decrease it. One possible hand wave here is that perhaps there were differences in the recording environment, but it's really not that clear. So anyway, that's all I've got for today. I think the really interesting take-homes are that it is possible to have control over the alpha oscillation. It's possible. There's been demonstration that it can be at least certainly decreased, but some suggestion that it can be increased as well. And then there's this strange question that we're left with, which is why can't participants identify the feelings and patterns associated with the alpha state when they're able to control them? And so the possibility that I raise here is that the alpha state could be quite different when it's randomly occurring versus when it's being controlled. But another possibility, somewhat more mundane, that Black et al. Are going to want to push is that maybe it's because the control of the alpha state is an operantly conditioned thing happening entirely outside of awareness, whereas the discrimination is something that we're asking participants to do inside awareness. And there's such separation between awareness and non-awareness that we can't cross that gap. Anyway, I'll be looking into this a little bit more, hopefully, in some future experiments, and thanks for watching.